It's been so wonderful. Thank you so
Well,
much.
I should say, Rabbi, I've added an extra 3 sessions because so much has happened in the month since we started. I really could actually. No, but I won't.
Well, we could do that, like we'll see. I'm sure this isn't the last time we'll be studying or learning with you. I'm sure.
Yeah.
So,
All right. You tell me when to go, Rabbi. I am
all
ready.
right. Well, we have 16 people so far. Let's just give it another, minute. And
I, I will share something. I saw a news flash, I think, from the New York Times that the FDA is recommending a booster for everyone now, which I hope will happen because I was just talking to the rabbi that they did a big survey in Israel and it was published in the medical journal The Lancet, and they tested like 700,000 people who had corona and 700,000 people who didn't. And in this last wave of corona, who got corona? Even like, so those who had corona had one vaccine, and those who didn't had two vaccines. And there was a much lower incidence of infection amongst people who had corona. So on the first one. Although that doesn't relate to the FDA. Oh, but the good news is that Israelis in large numbers went and got the third vaccine. We're in a situation today where it's like in many places in the world, it is the pandemic now of the unvaccinated. We went to one of our son's friend's wedding last night, and you have to wear your mask and you have to show your green passport as you go in. And my wife forgot her phone. She said, I'm at a wedding. I'm going to a wedding. Where am I going to put my phone? So kids and I were like struggling. So I went onto the HMO app, and we're both in the same app. So I managed to get her vaccination record or whatever to show that she was able to go in. So it's good news.
I went to a restaurant last night, and in order to eat inside, you had to show your vaccination card.
Well, that they've been doing in Israel already for a very long time.
Well, I mean, you can eat outside without it, but you can't eat inside. So anyway, let me just check. All right, I think we can start. So I'm going to turn off my camera and I will talk to you after.
Well, shalom, y'all. I know you're not from Texas, but I gotta say, when I do these sessions, it's always interesting for me because I see myself, which is fine. But I look forward to the moment we'll actually be able to live and be able to communicate face to face. Anyway, we're in session 5, 6. I have that sign in front of me that says slow down, so I will. And the last 2 sessions deal only with 20 years, which means about a decade each. Today we're going to look at 1998, post beginning of the Oslo Accords and the peace with Jordan, the murder of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, 1995, and then the kind of escalation or descent, shall we say, into more terrorism, multiple elections, and a lot of instability within Israel. And we're going to end today's session at about 2010, 2011, the Arab Spring. And then the last section will deal a lot, next week, we'll do a lot with Gaza, a lot with Lebanon, and a lot with Syria. Because we talked already in our previous sessions of many wars, the 48 War of Independence and the 56 Suez Campaign and the 67 Six-Day War and the 70-71 War of Attrition and the 73 Yom Kippur War. And recently, last week, I think, I talked about the first war of choice in Lebanon in 82. But in this week and next week, we're going to talk a lot more about operations, shorter scale operations. Their war in Lebanon, we'll see in 2006, but it was a war unlike any other wars in that it wasn't multi-front and it wasn't against a country. As I mentioned last week, it was against, in this case in Lebanon in 2006, Hezbollah terrorist organization. We're also going to talk about Startup Nation. Israel is known internationally as the place for startup technology, and we'll tell a little story about that in particular. If you haven't read this book by Dan Senior and Shaul Singer, I highly recommend it. It's basically the recipe, the secret sauce of how Israel is so successful in terms of high tech. It doesn't mean Israelis are more polite than they were. It doesn't mean that Israelis are, more patient these days. But it means that Israel economically is in a very different place. And if you look at the skyline here of Tel Aviv, most of these buildings were not up about 20, 25 years ago. And a lot of that has to do with Startup Nation. And the last session is going to end. That's me getting my first vaccine in March. I got it 3 months later because I'd had corona a year beforehand. But Israel, I think in the past year is seen internationally as vaccination. Thankfully, Pfizer chose us to be the guinea pig. It's good news because so far so good. Yes, there are people with side effects, but no question that Israel is ahead of the curve in terms of the booster, in terms of vaccinations in general. I want to start though. Last week we talked about the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin in 95 and how Perez, his heir, took over. Netanyahu won the election in 1996, and then Ehud Barak, what many people, I should say, thought was the heir to Yitzhak Rabin, former commander-in-chief of the Israel Defense Forces, and for the second time, having direct elections, we saw in 96, Bibi beat out Perez by a slim margin. Ehud Barak won. Notice, it was like less than 1% in 1996, you might remember. And now, 56.1 to 43.9. That is a very large margin. In countries like America, with your democratic challenges, Israel with our multi-party system, 56 to 44 is a huge, huge margin. Except, at that time, the elections were two ballots. One for the prime minister, and we only had two, maybe three elections like this, and the other for the party. So the Labour Party received 26 seats, and Likud, Netanyahu's party, received 19. Now, if you're not a math major, there are 120 seats in our Knesset, our parliament. That means that 120 minus the 45 of the left of center party Labour and the right of center party Likud, that leaves you with, 75 seats. In other words, 75 seats went to a number of smaller parties, and very few went to the larger parties. But Barak was elected by 56% of the population. Nobody had ever received that much vote directly in any election in Israel. In the summer of 2000, President Clinton invited Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat to Camp David. The idea was to talk, as I mentioned last week, the Oslo Accords in 1994 between Israel and the Palestinians. The idea was that in 5 years, the two parties will discuss the most difficult, potentially insurmountable issues. I have them here. Final borders between the two entities, the settlements, the Jews who live in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, Jerusalem. Will it be an international city? Will it be a city that is two cities? What will happen to the Palestinian refugees? Will they have the right to come back? And what about water? Who controls that vital natural resource, very little of which we have, of water? There was no agreement at Camp David. Everything was verbal, and there are multiple versions as to why. In this picture you see, of course, you recognize Clinton and Barak and Arafat on the right-hand side. Why did it fail? Now, if you ask President Clinton, and he speaks about this, Dennis Ross, one of his major aides who was there, wrote extensively about this. Clinton said, "I regret that in 2020, at Camp David, Arafat missed the opportunity to bring that nation into being and pray for the day when the dreams of the Palestinian people for a state and a better life will be realized in a just and lasting peace." If you ask Israeli Prime Minister Barak, he said, Arafat, his performance, quote, geared to exact as many Israeli concessions as possible without ever seriously intending to reach a peace settlement or sign an end to the conflict. And if you ask the Palestinians, Arafat is long dead, but if you ask the Palestinians who were there, they will say, listen, we felt we were boxed in by the Israelis and the Palestinians. We were forced into making agreements which we didn't agree upon. And perhaps symbolic of the Palestinians was the pushing. That one image when there was a kind of a tussle almost between Barak and Arafat over who would go into the cabin first. And, essentially Barak said, no, you go first, and the typical Israeli style, you go first, and kind of nudged him a little bit too much. But Arafat came back, and we'll see shortly later that fall, the second intifada breaks out. I should have mentioned, perhaps I should reverse the order of the slides, but I wanted to talk about Barak's election first. One of Barak's campaigns was to withdraw from Lebanon. Remember last week, a war of choice? Israel went into southern Lebanon to remove the PLO, the terror bases in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah took over southern Lebanon. And in 2000, Barak said in 1999, if I'm elected within 1 year, I will bring the boys home from Lebanon. Israel was still losing 25 to 30 soldiers while maintaining a presence in the South Lebanese area with the SLA, not the Patty Hearst SLA, but the South Lebanese army. There was a lot of public pressure because our boys were, not mine, but Israeli boys were spending weeks and months, and many people compared it to the American Vietnam, as I mentioned last week. Very different because it's right next door, of course. And on May 24th, in a surprise move, within 24 hours, all the soldiers, 100% of them who had been, again, in that security zone since 1985. Remember last week, June of 82, Israel launches the Operation Peace for the Galilee, the first Lebanese war, and it takes 2.5 years until Israel maintains just a security zone, which it held from 1985 until 2000. And here you see the headline, Ima Yatsanu mi Lebanon. Mom, we've left Lebanon. And I can tell you, as a parent of 2 soldiers, well, 3 soldiers, my middle one, my daughter, wasn't in combat, but my eldest, who's out of the army now, and my youngest, who's still in the Air Force for another less than 2 months, but who's counting days, actually 45 days or so, we're very glad when they get out of the army. We don't know actually most of what my son does, so I guess I'll just be glad that he'll be home and sleeping at home. The UN, a month later, sent in inspectors, and they walked along what was the 1919-1922 border determined between the French and the British, which was agreed upon by Israel and Lebanon in 1949 in the armistice. And that agreement of 425, don't remember the numbers, but the agreement from 1978, remember that operation? The terrorists attacked, 30 Israelis were killed on the coast in 78. Israel launched a retaliatory operation up to the Litani River. The UN condemned it. The UN set up the UNIFIL organization, and they passed this resolution. And in 2000, Israel withdrew to Lebanon. What was Barak talking about in Camp David? One of the things that Barak threw out there, as you look at this very complicated map, and again, don't look at resolution, look at the colors. It's interesting on my screen, I can see the 2, Susan and Hannah from the synagogue, both the S and W, you can see the same colors on the map. It was totally by chance. But the blue in this color is Jewish, and the green on this map is Arab. And you look at the pink line, it's kind of hard to see, but I'll draw with my cursor. The pink line is the municipal boundary of Jerusalem. There, for example, is the Old City. This is what we call oftentimes Western or Israeli or Jewish Jerusalem. This is East Jerusalem. But up over here is Ramallah, the Palestinian political and economic center. And down south over here is Bethlehem. And in between, you can see are a mixture of Jewish neighborhoods, blue, and Arab neighborhoods. Jewish, Arab, Jewish, Arab. And Barak's idea was quite simple. Let's take all of this area, including Greater Jerusalem, not just what is within this pink area, but the area of Gush Etzion, the Etzion block, where Jews have lived since the 1940s, kicked out in 48 and came back in the 70s, 60s. Ma'ale Adumim, just east of Jerusalem on the way to the Dead Sea. Givat Ze'ev, north of Jerusalem. These 3 enclaves that are predominantly Jewish will be incorporated into this blue, you see? And that blue will be a larger Israeli city called Jerusalem. And the quid pro quo Barak said was that the Palestinians can have a capital city running from Ramallah in the north to Bethlehem in the south via the Arab neighborhoods of Jerusalem. And what did President Clinton say? Well, that's a great idea. And we'll take Jerusalem's holy city, old city, and the area around it, referred to at Camp David as the Holy Basin, and that area will be where we will have an international zone. Now, the idea was never implemented. Again, lots of reasons, but that was Barak's idea, heavily criticized within Israel, by the way, not just from the right, but from the left. How can you compromise in the old city? Who's going to guarantee our security? That was Barak's idea. Don't worry about this map. That was Barak's idea in 2000. After the failure in July of Camp David, there is still a lot of discourse in Israel, as I mentioned. How can you even consider compromising in Jerusalem, the eternal, never to be divided capital of Jerusalem? And after that, the leader of the opposition, Ariel Sharon, there he is on the right-hand side, decides on the 28th of September to go up in a very demonstrable act, to go up to the Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are, the holiest site in the Jewish world, and to basically say to the Israeli public, listen, your Prime Minister, Barak, is prepared to give up the Holy Grail in Jerusalem. I'm not. If I'm ever elected Prime Minister, no way. This is, the foundation stone, the mother of our connection to this land. February 2021, 7 months after Camp David, Israel went to an election, and look at the results. 62 to 37%. Huge difference. Again, I said a few minutes ago, Barak's, 56 to 44 was remarkable. This is even larger than that. It was the 3rd election direct Prime Minister, but Sharon, on the political right over there, actually his Likud party had fewer seats than Ehud Barak's on the left-hand side. But it didn't matter because the people put Sharon in power. And when you've got an Israeli leader who got almost 2/3 of the popular vote, that's unprecedented in Israel. So he assumes prime minister in the spring of 2001. The Intifada, I would not say was sparked by Sharon going up to the Temple Mount, but I would say that this visit was another coal or another burning ember on a fire that was already low fire that was already existing. And then really in the September, October, this massive wave of violence in Gaza, in the West Bank, and all over Israel pre-67. And a lot of broke out, and dozens of incidents with, and this is on Rehov Dizengoff actually, on Rehov Allenby in Tel Aviv. Unfortunately, I know a woman whose brother was killed in this bus incident from Glasgow, England, actually. And not a week went by when there wasn't another incident. The Dolphinarium Memorial in Tel Aviv on the beach, where 20 young, mostly Russian immigrant teenagers were waiting in line to a dance club for kids under 18, so no alcohol served. And a terrorist waited in line with him and blew himself up and killed more than 20 people. But the tragedy of the Intifada, in addition to the loss of life, was the fact that the Intifada was not Palestinians attacking Jews in Gaza and the West Bank. Most Israelis, myself included, I think, realized that the Palestinian Intifada was about all of Israel. In other words, it wasn't just, okay, end the occupation, which we hear all too often these days, but it was end the occupation of all of Israel. Otherwise, strategically, why would they attack within the borders that, if you seemingly accept and recognize Israel as a right to exist, why attack Haifa? Why attack Tel Aviv? So it really, I think, sent a lot of Israelis into a sense of shock, particularly the center left, who had believed and I think still does believe in Israel, in a two-state solution, but recognized that the people that we want to have this two-state solution with might not be interested because for them, for many of them at least, the occupation is about all of Israel, not, quote, just, unquote, the West Bank. You might remember in the height of the Intifada, Israel captured one of a couple boats. This one was the Karine A, somewhere in the Red Sea. This is all weapons sent from Iran to Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip. All right, crazy stuff, massive weaponry supplies, and as I said, unfortunately, too many pictures of too many. I mean, just horrible. I can't think of any Western country that had such an unprecedented wave of terror over 2000 and 2004. Again, while Israelis were uncomfortable going out to restaurants or sitting on a bus, this is a bus in the city of Haifa on the bottom. At that time, the images of the screen were both these young Palestinian kids trying to win the occupation, David with his little stone against Goliath, where Israelis were not able to lead a normal sense of life. And I remember living in Jerusalem, at least at the beginning of the Intifada, with 3 young kids. My wife and I would have the discussion, okay, going shopping, who should go? Could we go together? Can we sit in an outdoor cafe? Because, last week there was a bombing on Emek Rafaim in Jerusalem, and I don't know. And it was a real crazy situation. The worst, unfortunately, numerically, tragedy in the Intifada was when 31 people were killed at the Park Hotel Massacre on Passover Eve, March 27, 2002. A terrorist came in as these 31 people and many more were waiting. You can see mostly elderly people, actually, were waiting to start the story of the exodus from Egypt, and the terrorist came in and blew himself up. Because of that incident, and again, the Intifada had really started end of September, beginning of October 2000 already. We're well into it. Israel launched in the spring of 2002 something called Operation Defensive Shield. And Operation Defensive Shield was the largest land operation in the West Bank and Gaza since the 1967 Six-Day War. The second decision it made, you'll see soon, was a decision to construct a security barrier. And the idea was quite simply, listen, if you, the Palestinian Authority, cannot stop terror attacks coming from your territory, then we're going to go in there and find the bomb makers, find the factories. In fact, this is a picture of the Israeli tanks outside the Mukata, the headquarters of Arafat and the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. And of course, Israel was accused of genocide, unfortunately, in Jenin. Dozens of Israeli soldiers were killed. A colleague of mine and I was seriously injured, actually, in one of those incidents. And the kind of toward the end of this operation, the group of terrorists took over the Basilica of the Nativity, the place in Christian tradition where Jesus was born in the city of Bethlehem. And the Israeli Defense Forces kind of surrounded them and didn't let them out. And there's a lot of bad press happening. It's kind of hard to win when you have a terror conflict going on inside of urban areas, and you have these airplanes and tanks and everything else. But ultimately, the whole intifada between 2000 and 2004, somewhere in the area of about 1,400 Israelis were killed, probably about 2,500 to 3,000 Palestinians were killed. A very crazy time, 2000 to 2004. The second government decision, in addition to the operation into the West Bank, was to construct a security barrier. Call it a fence, call it a wall. It depends what newspaper you're reading, what TV station you're watching. Is it a separation barrier, an apartheid wall? It can't be an apartheid wall because there never was an apartheid wall. Apartheid was a different system that was used to basically enslave the majority black culture by a white imperialist culture, community that never had a connection to South Africa. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is about two people who most Israelis and Palestinians recognize have a legitimate right to national self-determination, number one. Number two, 20% of Israelis are Palestinians. Number three, there are a lot of Israeli Jews who live on the other side of the security barrier. So very different in terms of technology, in terms of language. I refer to it as a security barrier. Not everybody does, of course. And the idea in April of 2002 was to build this massive structure, some of it concrete over here, about 25 feet high, some of it a electronic fence. Not electric, nothing will happen to you if you touch it, but a sensor will go off in a base nearby, and a soldier, female soldier, because boys don't have the patience to watch on monitors, will send a jeep to patrol to see who's coming across that security barrier. It's over 450 miles long, not 100% complete, and there are a lot of openings. There are about 120,000, maybe more now, Palestinians who work every single day in Israel. My son is a contractor. He employs under half a dozen at any given time. They have a permit. They go as if you're going, I'm going in an airplane tonight to Canada, as if you're going and you have your passport and you have your visa and whatever else you need, daily backwards and forwards. But there are tens of thousands who come illegally, through the fence, over the fence, in a break in the fence, etc. And the idea was psychological for Israelis, but also the idea was to try to prevent this unprecedented onslaught of terrorism. And one of the pictures I took a few years ago in Bethlehem, here you can see the Palestinian side. They, quote, decorate the security barrier. Definitely doesn't look that way on the Israeli side. And in the pillbox on the left-hand side, that's where the Israeli soldiers sit and watch over. In fact, I took this picture and I sent it to one of my daughter's best friends. She had just gotten out of the army, but her job was literally in that pillbox, or being in charge of the soldiers who sat in that box monitoring the protests and the Molotov cocktails and everything else. And just on the other side of that, of course, is Israel. The Supreme Court of Israel, which actually has two capacities. One, it's a court of appeals from our two lower courts. And secondly, it is a high court of justice that deals with appeals by anybody who feels that any branch of the Israeli government has committed an injustice to them. And so there have been multiple appeals of where the security barrier goes or should go by Palestinians. And ultimately, the court ruled that the government of Israel, just read the yellow, has a responsibility to balance, as any court does, a series of rights. Right to life, right to livelihood, and a right to the movement of freedom. So the primary emphasis of the security barrier, as agreed upon by the Israeli government, was to protect Israelis. But at the same time, how do you build a barrier that protects Israelis but doesn't unnecessarily limit the accessibility of Palestinians to their jobs, maybe their olive orchards, and to get from one Palestinian town to the other? And so in the ruling, I'm not going to read all of it, I'm just going to read the highlighted part. This is what Chief Justice Barak wrote in his ruling. Our task is difficult. We are members of Israeli society. Although we are sometimes in an ivory tower, that tower is in the heart of Jerusalem, which is not infrequently hit by ruthless terror. Regarding the state's struggle against the terror that rises up against it, we are convinced that at the end of the day, A struggle according to the law will strengthen her power and her spirit. There is no security without law. Satisfying the provisions of law is an aspect of national security. And ultimately, based on this ruling, in September of 2005, the Supreme Court ordered the government to alter the route of the barrier to ensure that the negative impact on the fabric of Palestinian life would be minimized and proportional. Doesn't mean it's perfect, doesn't mean total justice has been achieved. There's still lots of outcry from Palestinians and all over the world and voices within Israel over construction of this barrier. It's ugly in some places. You can see on the southeastern side of Jerusalem, this is the Israeli side, that's the Palestinian side. But as one of the chief planners and architects of it, Colonel Danny Tirza, he went to Berlin to kind of do research before constructing it. And he said, just like Berlin, the wall existed from 61 to 89. So too here, there's a wall, and eventually this wall will be taken back as well. That was 2002. I said starting the construction. I talked about the operation 2002, 2004, the Intifada is continuing. But then Sharon, elected by the political right, decides that he is going to withdraw from Gaza. Israel had small percentage of Gaza in control, but Sharon said, you know what? If we want to live a Jewish democratic country, we cannot control 8,000 people living in Gaza and almost 1.7, 1.8 million people, Palestinians at that time. And so the Knesset passed a law called the Disengagement Plan Implementation Law, which called for Israel to remove the settlements in Gaza, as it had done in 1982 in Sinai, when we returned Sinai to Egypt. And in return, the Jews who lived there would be compensated. There was a lot of concern that this might lead to civil war. As Sharon said, it is out of strength and not weakness that we're taking this step. But the problem for Sharon was that he lost the support of much of his party, including the guy at the time who was his finance minister, who later became the prime minister, who is now the former prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And Netanyahu led a departure of, I think, 13 or 15 members of the parliament. Sharon, therefore, had to build a new coalition, and he turned to the political left, got in Shimon Peres, and they joined the Labour Party, his coalition with the Likud Party, in order to pass what Peres and Sharon both thought was necessary for Israel. As a result, 8,300 Jews were taken down from 21 settlements in Gaza, an additional 700 from 4 settlements in northern West Bank, Samaria. And you can see by the response and the resistance of the Jews living there. The sign on the bottom in Hebrew says, Shenit Kfar Darom Lot Ipol. Kfar Darom, the community that they were living in, won't fall a second time, because it fell in the War of Independence, right? Jews had lived there before even Israel was born. They said, it's not going to happen again. It did happen. There's still a lot of bitterness amongst those who left what they believe were forcibly evicted from Gaza, even though they had moved there because it was a priority of the government of Israel. Sharon, after the disengagement in the summer of 2005, realizes he's going to create a new party, what is called in Israeli politics the Big Bang. He forms this party called Kadima, which literally means progress or forward, interesting word. And after this disengagement, he realized that he could no longer govern as the head of the Likud party. So he went to Shimon Peres, as I said, on the left, and they together formed this party. Except shortly after they formed it, Sharon had a stroke, and his deputy prime minister, Ehud Olmert, became head of the Kadima party. In the first elections in this joint banner, Kadima got more seats than anybody else and formed a government under Ehud Olmert. However, 3 years later, under Tzipi Livni, let me put the pictures. There is Sharon on the right, who, together with Peres, to his left, put them in that order, founded the party in 2005. They had elections. By the time they had elections in 2006, Ehud Olmert won. And by 2009, Ehud Olmert stepped down from prime minister. You see, Olmert was under investigation. He was found guilty of graft and bribery, and ultimately was sent to prison and did time in prison. At the time that he was prime minister, the leader of the opposition was Netanyahu. And Netanyahu said to him, how can you continue to be prime minister of the country while you're in court every day dealing with this court trial? And he stepped aside. And in his place came Tzipi Livni. What's fascinating is that you might not realize this, but our former former Prime Minister Netanyahu, is currently being investigated, and there are 3 trials happening against him. But he never stepped aside in any of those trials, even though a decade before he was highly critical of his predecessor. 2009, Tzipi Livni's second time a serious prime ministerial candidate ran, except she won the elections. Her party got 28 seats. Netanyahu's Likud got 27. But because of the nature of the Israeli political system, which it necessitates the formation of a coalition to pass or to reach a minimum of 61 of 120 seats in our parliament, she was unable to do so. And so the president, the head of state, who has very few roles, one of which is to call upon whatever party he or she thinks is most likely to form a government, instead of going to Tzipi Livni, whose Kadima party got more seats than Likud's, the president went to Netanyahu and said, you can try to form a government. And he did. Eventually, this big party, which won the elections in 2006, went down to 6 seats, and then it didn't even run in the 2015 election, and it has disappeared. The story of, unfortunately or not, many Israeli kind of centrist parties appear out of nowhere, rise, and then fall very, very quickly. So too the story of Kadima, which many thought was the solution to the future. When you bring moderate left and moderate right and center together, didn't last too long. In January of 2006, there were Palestinian elections for the second time. After the Oslo Accords in 1996, there were elections for the Palestinian Authority. Yasser Arafat and his won as president, and his party, the nationalist PLO, Fatah, won the parliamentary elections. In 2006, however, you'll see the green, if I can figure it right over here, green is Fatah in the West Bank. This is the West Bank on the right, and this is Gaza. Green in the West Bank, majority of Fatah. Yellow, I got it wrong. Yellow is Fatah, Arafat. So very small percentage in Gaza. Green is Hamas. Here, it's much more of an even split. And as a result of these democratic elections, international observers, including President Carter, came to see them. As a result of the elections, Hamas, the terror organization we met last week, founded in 1988, remember, by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the opposition in Egypt, one of whom killed President Sadat, you might remember. They supported Hamas once the Intifada started in Gaza in 88. They got 44.5%, and Fatah got 41.43%. Interesting, but who could vote and where could vote? But it was also a decade between the elections in 96 and the elections in 2006. And so there was a new government formed under Prime Minister of Palestine, or Palestinian areas, Ismail Haniyeh from Hamas. Except there then, shortly thereafter, was a civil war between the members of the two organizations, the religious organization of Hamas and the national organization of Fatah. Hundreds, over 118, of the PLO people were killed by Hamas, some of them thrown off of windows, and afterwards Hamas took over. And ever since then, in 2007, that's 14 years, there have been 2 entities. Gaza, ruled by Hamas. Israel and Hamas don't get along. They're, as I say, dedicated to our destruction. And Fatah, whether we agree or not, they have kind of come to agree to live side by side with us, even though they don't necessarily like us. Look at this picture of Hamas taking over the office of the PLO leadership in Gaza in June of 2017. A lot of people forget, but a mini civil war between factions within the Palestinian Authority. In our northern front in that same year, just before then I should say, was an attack on the 12th of July. This is Lebanon. This is the fence. That little blue thing over there is the UN marker, and this is an Israeli barrier on our side to protect us. It's not the security barrier, it's to protect soldiers along here. Unfortunately, that wasn't there, and on the day of the 12th of July, an Israeli patrol on this road was attacked by Hezbollah from Lebanon. These 3 soldiers were killed. These 2 were wounded, dragged back into Lebanon. Unfortunately, they probably died shortly thereafter. But the search for the boys then very quickly escalated into the Second Lebanese War. And again, it's a bit of a misnomer. It's not a war between Israel and Lebanon. It's a war between Israel and a terror organization in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah. It lasts for 33 days. Don't read all the stuff, sorry. And in many ways, I think one can look at this as the first Iran-Israel proxy war. What do I mean? The Iranians, Shiite, the majority, Shiite theological revolution in the late 70s under Ayatollah Khomeini. Many of you might even be Persian originally. Then you have Iraq, which has a Shiite majority, and now governance is Shiite majority. And then as you come across, you go to Lebanon and to Syria, where there's Shiite minorities. And Hezbollah, as we saw last week, was founded in the 1980s by Iranian clerics as a branch, in a sense, of the Shia Iranian revolution. And in many ways, this 2006 operation / war, which lasted for over a month, began. Ultimately, the resolution passed by the UN called for Israel to withdraw to the international border, of course, once again. And if you look at these two pictures found on the internet, this is the neighborhood where the Shia leadership of Hezbollah was based in Beirut before the war. And this is flattened totally by the Israel Air Force during that month-long plus operation in July and August of 2006. At the time, about 4,500 rockets came to northern Israel. I remember asking our daughter, I'll tell you in the next slide, our daughter-in-law who lived up in that part of the country, what it felt like, and you'll see that in the next slide. The leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, came out of his bunker, and when he came out of his bunker, he said, quote, if there was even a 1% chance that the capturing operation, right, attacking, killing all 5 Israeli soldiers, and kidnapping 2 of them, would have led to a war like the one that happened, who would have done it? I would say no, absolutely not, for humanitarian, moral, social, security, military, and political reasons. Oh, I didn't realize Israel would take it that seriously, that we infringed upon sovereign soil and we attacked their soldiers on their side of the border. Who knew? He, unfortunately for him, has not left his bunker pretty much since 2006. Hezbollah rockets reached in that war basically as far as Netanya, the area of Beit Shan over here in Lebanon. Larger rockets, smaller rockets. The point is that they shot 4,500 rockets in 34 days. Israeli military experts suggest that if there were another war with Lebanon, they would shoot about 4,000 rockets a day into Israel, right? Huge difference. And they're continuing to try to find ways in which they can improve their weaponry. They're not a sovereign state, Hezbollah. They're a terror organization. They're politically represented in parliament and in government. But they have the largest in the world non-sovereign military that exists. And hey, that's just the way it is around the Middle East. It's unfortunate for Lebanon, and you follow the news, and I'm not going to go into it. It's a mess. There are a commission of inquiry over what happened in the port of Beirut over here last year, who was negligent. But these colors, without going deep into the resolution, I put them there to show you that the purple is the Shia, that is the smaller group in Islam. The Sunnah is the majority, and the majority of Shia live in this area over here, that Mount Lebanon, and in this area in the south on the border with Israel, and that is where Hezbollah is still located there. Oh, hold it, and where are we here? Yes. So, for example, the military published this from a research center, Alma, up in the Galilee, where there are rockets, because you're not dealing with an army against an army. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges Israel has faced and continues to face in the last 40 years. When we think, and I say we, that those of us, northwards of 50, and remember 67, maybe less, or 73 or 48, those were wars, not 48, those were wars with airplanes and tanks and infantry against infantry. Now you're dealing with terror organizations, PLO, Hezbollah, Hamas, and you're dealing with groups who intentionally embed themselves in civilian populations and intentionally target civilian targets. And Israel is always accused of, well, it's not fair, you have more sophisticated weapons. It's true, we do have more sophisticated weapons. We also have invest billions in technology to have rockets that shoot things out of the air to protect our civilians. In sharp contrast, you'll see over here where they have, these are areas where there are rockets in close, all these red and blue things are bases and places where they've either shot rockets from or they're storing rockets in southern Lebanon. And here you can see in proximity to the school, in proximity to the mosque. And so if Israel is to target the rockets where they're launched from, it becomes a problem because you're shooting at a very urban area in which there are civilian institutions, the schools and mosques and things like that, and houses, of course. It's a real challenge that Israel has faced, and I think, unfortunately, will continue to face. It's what's called asymmetric warfare. But I quote Michael Bloomberg, former mayor of New York, who came in the 2014 war with Gaza, and he said, listen, the journalists were asking him, and they said, but it's asymmetric warfare, it's not fair. And he said, when it comes to terrorism, there is no such thing as asymmetric warfare. And that's a big challenge that Western democracies, America has felt it, the controversy of the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars, and the role of the American military. Israel faces that on a daily basis because we've got neighbors who ideologically and theologically don't think we should be here. And many times Israel spends inordinate amount of resources to try to make sure that the game doesn't change on the ground. For example, we saw last week or 2 weeks ago in 81, Israel destroyed the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981. What happens in 2007? Israel finds out that Syria, together with North Korea, is building a nuclear reactor. And so on September 6th, my wife's birthday, the Israel Air Force sent 8 planes, much closer to Syria than to Iraq, to destroy the plant. Israel maintained silence for years, but only eventually did it come public. And ultimately, it seems now that there was agreement between Israeli Prime Minister Olmert and the guy who was still the president of Turkey, Erdogan, at the time, because he didn't want Syria to have the bomb either. Here is an image, again, satellite image from your government of before and after Israel destroyed the nuclear reactor. And using the Israeli aircraft, a lot of electronic jamming as well. It only 11 years later publicly admitted that it took it out. And here you can see a picture, as I showed last week, of General putting from the Air Force putting that little kill sticker of the nuclear reactor in Iraq in 81, but in this case, the Syrian reactor taken out by the Israeli Air Force in 2007. Unfortunately, after Hamas takes over, there's no peace process. There can't be a peace process with people who have the theology/ideology that they have. And he talked about that. And so as indiscriminate rocket fire escalates toward the end of 2008, around Hanukkah time, Israel launches an aerial attack, goes into a land operation called Cast Lead, lasts about a week, of course. And for the first time, the rockets from Gaza were not just, and I use the word just, and I always feel bad because I know people who live next door to Gaza, like literally within 5 miles. In some cases, their moshav shares the fence with Gaza. And it's tragic because those people, many of them, used to go to Gaza, used to have workers from Gaza, have a lot of personal relations as well. But now the rockets went to much larger urban areas, the city of Ashdod and Ashkelon, 500,000 people, Beersheba and the Bedouin around Beersheba, another 500,000 people, with much greater accuracy. Israel declared a ceasefire about 3 weeks into it, and then the Goldstone report, and that same why is this here? Sorry, 2001. Forget that. The wrong slide. I don't know why that got there. Anyway, and here you can see storage. Israeli finding some of these literally homemade. Here's a house in a basement of some of these very cheap, unsophisticated rockets that aren't very accurate, but still do the job in terrorizing Israelis. Where? You can see, here's the Gaza Strip. And to put it in context, I know there was just a marathon in New York the other day. That's 42.2 kilometers, about 26 miles. The Gaza Strip from the north, where I am in yellow, to the south is 40 kilometers. In other words, whoever won the marathon in 2 hours and 15 minutes could run from one side to the other in about 2 hours and 5 minutes, because it's less than the marathon distance. It's a sandy beach and it's hard, but that's how small it is. It's about 5 miles wide there, maybe about 8, maybe 10 miles wide over there. That's it. About 2 million Palestinians live there. But notice all these towns, Beersheba, it includes the Bedouin who live nearby, Ashdod, Ashkelon, about 1 million people now are within 25 miles, 40 kilometers of those Gaza rockets. So we've got a situation in 2006 in Lebanon. We've got a situation in 2009 in Gaza. And Olmert, sorry, did I say 2000? End of 2008. But in the midst of all of this, we're in the middle of an election campaign. And usually when there is a wave of terrorism or a war, there is generally, or rockets, generally a shift to the right in how Israelis vote. And so Olmert, the prime minister under investigation, said that, okay, I'm going to resign, we'll have a new leader. And he said, after being accused of corruption, Olmert, I'm proud to be a citizen of a country in which a prime minister can be investigated like any other citizen. And so shortly after this operation, December, January in Gaza, we had elections. The Kadima party, as I mentioned, under Tzipi Livni, got more seats than Netanyahu's 27 in the Likud, but the president tasked Netanyahu to form the government, which was formed in March. Netanyahu said the following when he was elected: the greatest danger to the state of Israel and to mankind in general will come from a radical regime that will try to arm itself with nuclear weapons. Talking about Iran, of course. Israel is facing two immense challenges on the economic and security fronts. Our decisions and actions will determine whether we're able to weather the storms. And at that point, Netanyahu gave us a sense of what was happening. The greatest attention in terms of his foreign policy was regarding Iran. 2009, there's a first major operation. The world is outraged. Israel is a blockade of Gaza. It's not just Israel, by the way. Israel and Egypt, because if you look at the map back over here, part of this border over there is Egypt. That's Egypt over in gray. This is Israel-controlled border, the Mediterranean controlled by Israel, to make sure that boats like the Karina A that we saw 50 minutes ago won't come in with weapons from North Korea or from Iran again. What happens in the spring of 2010? A flotilla, a bunch of boats together, were coming to Gaza to bring humanitarian aid into Gaza. Israel said, that's great. Bring it to our port in Ashdod, offload it. We'll make sure security that it goes in, that there's nothing that, that we don't want to go into Gaza. 10 ships set sail, sponsored by a Turkish Islamist organization. All of the boats were stopped by the IDF, except one, the Mavi Marmara. And this boat over there, there it is, the Mavi Marmara, couldn't. So Israel, the special forces, one of the most elite units in the IDF, the Navy Flotilla, the Shayetet, Shloshestre, they boarded the boat from ropes and were let down from helicopters. Unfortunately, as they were descending, they were attacked with knives and clubs and chains. In the fight that ensued, 9 died or killed then, and then another one died later on. And 10 Israeli soldiers were injured, not killed. And here you can see pictures of the people on the boat with their blocks and their clubs and their axes, literally trying to beat to death the Israeli soldiers who were coming from the helicopters down onto the boat. It led, this incident, to a rupture in Turkish-Israeli relations. Israel and Turkey had a very strong relations for many years. Remember, I said in 2007, the Turkish President Erdogan gave the green light, essentially, to Olmert, our prime minister, to attack the Syrian nuclear reactor. And eventually, Israel agreed to financial compensation for the families of those who were killed on the boat. This is all happening in 2010, but later on in December of 2010, the so-called Arab Spring, and that's why I put it in quotes, begins as a young fruit seller in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi. His merchandise was confiscated. He was slapped, humiliated by the police. Enraged, he self-immolated. He burned himself alive. Seriously injured. He died shortly thereafter in the hospital. And protests ensued. Eventually, the president fled. But this started a wave, a tidal wave, really, of peaceful demonstrations and armed resistance from Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, less Lebanon, but Syria, a couple Gulf states and kind of low embers. Yemen, of course, is still happening. Here's a picture of the young hero who put himself on fire. And as I say, the streets across the Middle East were ignited with this sense of growing restive youth who were very upset by the status quo. Many military leaders, many dictators. Ultimately, we know what happened in Egypt, but this was the spark. And here I got a short little video. I can make it big enough screen, and you can hear it.
In 2010, a produce vendor in Tunisia stood in front of a government office and set himself on fire, killing himself. His desperate desperate actions helped spark a revolutionary uprising that has come to be known as the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring timeline began in Tunisia, a country that had been under the allegedly corrupt and authoritarian rule of President Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali for more than 2 decades. On December 17, 2010, a working-class vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi was approached by Tunisian authorities about his unlicensed cart. He offered to pay a fine, but instead his vegetables were confiscated, and he was publicly humiliated by the police. Afterwards, to add insult to injury, local officials refused to hear his complaints of harassment. In a show of protest, Bouazizi stood in front of the local governor's office and set himself on fire. He died from his injuries on January 4th. Bouazizi became a martyr who inspired others who were suffering from unemployment at the hands of a corrupt government. His death sparked a Tunisian revolution in which protesters armed themselves not only with signs, but with cell phones, allowing the protest to spread at social media speed. On January 11th, a week after Bouazizi's death, Tunisia's government fell apart, and the disgraced president Ben Ali fled the country. The videos of the successful uprising shared via social media raised global awareness of the protests themselves. State-run news organizations were barely able to keep up. The speed and success of the protest inspired others across the region. Throughout January, protests erupted in Algeria, Jordan, and Oman. By January 25th, the movement reached Egypt, followed by Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Libya, and several other countries. On February 11th, Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak stepped down, and by the end of the year, Yemen's government was overthrown.
So a bit of a sense, a bit of a review. Arab Spring, unfortunately, we're not in the spring, we're maybe in the fall or winter of discontent now, but massive change across the Middle East. And I think that in order to understand that, we have to realize that much of the Middle East, not all of it, but much of the Middle East are modern nation states that never had historical existence. Not to say that there should not be any legitimacy to a group of people who organize and want to form a nation state. But if we look particularly in depth at our neighbors in Lebanon and in Syria, they're just made up of multiple ethnic religious groups who really struggle to find a commonality of a national identity. What's amazing, I mean, don't get me wrong, we've got our issues in Israel, you've got your issues in America as well, but ultimately the formation of modern Israel and the formation of America, fundamentally different than the nature of the formation of the countries in the Middle East, and they're struggling. 100 years after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which the French and the British kind of divided up the Middle East amongst imperial powers, and then they created these states, the countries are still struggling with who they are and what their identity is. At the same time, did I miss this? At the same time, I'm missing a slide here. Yeah. What happened 10 years later? So there are the pictures in 2010, and in 2011, sorry, and here are the pictures in 2021. You can tell because they're wearing masks, but there's still protests. A decade later, not everything is 100% smooth. There are lots and lots of issues across the Middle East. Saddam Hussein was toppled in Libya. Mubarak was toppled in Egypt. Syria is out of control. We'll see that more next week. Yemen, too much bloodletting happening all across the Middle East as we speak. At the same time, though, there was a protest within Israel, social protest in Israel over the high cost of living. It started in Rothschild Boulevard, one of the main north-south arteries, the most expensive real estate in town. Young people putting up tents, famous Israeli authors, including Meir Shalev in the middle and David Grossman on the left-hand side. High price of cottage cheese. And by the end, in the summer, there were about 10% of Israelis who were out on the street calling for social change, reducing the high cost of living, basic commodities from cottage cheese to housing. Tragically, now we're in the midst of a new government budget, which is not tragic. That's fantastic. We haven't had one in 3.5 years in Israel. But they're trying to figure out how to reduce the high cost of real estate. Real estate in real terms has doubled since these protests in 2011, to put it in context, unfortunately. But there were a few interesting consequences. It started social media. Someone said, why do we Israelis pay twice what Europeans pay for cottage cheese? This woman, Daphne Leaf, puts up a tent on Rothschild Boulevard, protesting the high cost of rent. Many, many people joined her, as I said, up to about 10% of the population, calling for the people, the people demand social justice. Free preschool education, that changed now. It's, I think, a year. I think it's free until until first grade, if I'm not mistaken. So your kindergarten and your pre-K are now free. New taxation system, no progress. Anti-selling nationalized companies, not really. Investing more resources in public houses and transportation, not really. But it did have a huge political impact. There were two main leaders, two main politicians who are today our prime minister and our replacement, our deputy prime minister, Naftali Bennett, who ran a party, the Jewish Home, and Yesh Atid, run by Yair Lapid. He got 19 seats. Bennett got 12 seats. That's 31 seats. 25% of people voted for these two parties, who said our major issue is not peace of the Palestinians, but major issue is making this place livable for young Israelis. And Lapid, who went from zero, no political government, no political party whatsoever, he was a journalist, got 1 out of every 6 votes, 19 out of 120, became the finance minister in a Netanyahu-led government. And these two joined the government under the condition that there would not be ultra-Orthodox, because in addition, represented in the government, because in addition to a protest over the high cost of living, there was an additional protest over the shirking of responsibility, as those two parties called it, of the ultra-Orthodox by not serving in the military. This all happened, as I said, 2011, impacted the elections in 2013. I mentioned at the beginning that Israel is known as this startup nation. We have the largest number of startups per capita in the world. In real terms, I think we're only after the United States. And remember, we're 9.3 million people. You're a little bit more than that. And one of the flagships of this idea in that decade, really, the mid-teens, I guess, so 2005 to 2015, was this idea that Shimon Peres, when he was president, at the Davos conference, challenged young economic leaders and said, listen, what are you going to do to make the world a better place? And Shai Agassi, an Israeli who was a high-ranking, one of the main CEO or whatever of SAP, a European software company, was asked by Peres, what are you going to do to make the world a better place? And he created a company, Agassi, called Better Place, which wanted to have this idea with Renault and with Nissan to have these battery-operated, rechargeable cars. It didn't work, but I would like to argue that Elon Musk's wealth in the past year in particular, in many ways, this kind of preceded the idea of Tesla, and it took a while until Tesla really, really began to take off. And of course, Shimon Peres infamously known, and I think this helps explain a lot of that secret sauce of Israel's success as the startup nation. And that was Peres saying that the greatest gift that the Jewish people have given humanity is dissatisfaction. We're not happy with the status quo. We got to do something about it. How do we make the world a better place? My grandmother used to say, Michael, that's what she called me, you got shpilkas. We would call it ants in the pants, but in many ways it's unhappy with where we are, knowing we can get to a better place in the future. And I think that's very important in the Israeli DNA. 2011, a story that is still riveting Israelis because he got married recently. Gilad Shalit, this young soldier, flanked by the prime minister at the time, Netanyahu, the defense minister, Barak, and the commander-in-chief of the IDF, Benny Gantz, who's today the defense minister, today the leader of the opposition, and today a guy in kind of political retirement. What happened was Shalit was captured in 2006 with the Hamas terrorists dug a tunnel from Gaza under the sand, and they emerged on the Israeli side. Here's the fence, right? They dug the tunnel from here up over there, and they emerged on the Israeli side. They attacked a tank, they killed a couple of soldiers, and they kidnapped Gilad Shalit. For 5.5 years, he was not allowed to have any direct communication with his family or the Red Cross. And it divided Israel because Israeli parents, like us, said, you can't send our kids into battle unless you're going to do whatever you can to bring them home. And in exchange, interestingly enough, Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed to release 1,027 Palestinian terrorists in Israeli prisons, many with blood on their hands, convicted of multiple murders of Israelis. Very controversial. And essentially, and there's a lot of opposition, including from those whose relatives had been murdered by these terrorists. But again, Netanyahu said we need to assure our citizens that whatever we can to bring back our boys. And in many ways, I think that is one of the biggest dilemmas that Israeli leaders face. You're damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you neglect to do whatever you can, leave no stone unturned to bring back our boys, thankfully, so far not girls, but captured, we know they're alive. Whatever price you have to pay to bring them back versus releasing and negotiating with terrorists or through Egypt in order to get a person alive back, it's a huge dilemma. And there were losers, of course, on both sides, but Gilad is back in Israel, just got married recently. Shortly thereafter, the first operation of something called Iron Dome, the most remarkable, revolutionary, and I think valuable technology invented in Israel, largely with American funding. Thank you, taxpayers. And it is this crazy system that was operated first in Operation Pillar of Defense, the fall of 2012. And it's a system that essentially shoots a Coke bottle at a rocket and with a 90% accuracy shoots it out of the air, blows it up in the air. There was another operation, the second in Gaza. Israel killed the head of the military wing of Hamas, major launching of rockets from Gaza. Israel retaliated, and thankfully, Egypt mediated a ceasefire shortly thereafter, after barely a week. But this crazy technology that can shoot multiple rockets, as soon as a rocket from Gaza, actually you'll see it in the next slide over there. Here are the rockets that are in Gaza. You can see the distance. No longer, remember the previous slide a few minutes ago? Beersheba, I said, now Ashdod. Now Tel Aviv, I'm talking to you from Modi'in, just over there. And Jerusalem, rockets shot out of the air can go that far, believe it or not, pretty much all over Israel. And what happens? When the radar of Iron Dome detects a rocket launch, based on its velocity, based on its arc, whatever it is, decides if the rocket calculates where it's going to land in seconds. If it's going to land in the ocean or in an open field, no interceptor rocket is shot. But if it's going to land in an area that is populated, an interceptor rocket will be shot. And there's a 90+ success rate. Now, what happens? Here are two pictures. One, this woman, Chen Kotler, lives on a kibbutz near Gaza. This is her miniature homemade museum. These are rockets, unsophisticated, because she lives next to the border. You don't need sophistication. You just need a bunch of rockets in the back of someone's truck, shot, and it terrorizes the population. It might kill them, it might wound them, it might not, but you want to terrorize people. These are from within the kibbutz where she lives. And this is a tourist I was guiding. We met a guy involved in the Iron Dome, and he showed us a picture, a real one, not a picture, of the top of the Iron Dome. So this is a friendly rocket on the left-hand side. And it's probably about 6 or 8 feet long, maybe 10, I don't know. But when this thing goes in the air and it intercepts a rocket, it explodes. And of course, all the shrapnel from the Iron Dome interceptor and the rocket fall somewhere. And that's why Israelis, every house built since 1991, has one room, not this one, but out that door behind me is my older son's former room. It's a bomb shelter. It's a very heavy metal door. There's a steel door, like 2 inches thick, that we close. And we had to, in May of last year, 2 or 3 times, my wife and I heard a siren in the middle of the night, had to get the cats, still got a scar from one of them, and bring them into that safe room. And we've got a minute and a half to do so. Chen has got 5 to 15 seconds to do whatever she's doing on the toilet, in the shower, having a food, meal, whatever, and rush into her shelter if there's a siren, and hope that Iron Dome rocket will actually shoot it out of the air. Another image of the rockets, of course, rockets from Gaza coming, the Iron Dome rockets intercepting, but it's over a city. And of course, there's probably going to be some shrapnel or fallout. And the last pictures for today, I think, here you can see a picture from a town of about 25,000 people, Sderot, next to Gaza. This is Gaza on the ridge over there in the blue, and this over here is Israel. You can see where there's an army base here, and there's another army base. That antenna is Israel. This is about half a mile from there to here. And so even a little rocket like this, that this reserve soldier is holding, this is a rocket, very simple, taken maybe from a telephone pole, someone cut down into, put into 6 or 7 pieces, very unsophisticated, very little explosives, generally pieces of metal, which good enough to kill someone anyway. And thousands and thousands and thousands of these have been shot from Gaza. But thankfully, because of, why can I go backwards? Because of Iron Dome, Israel is able to shoot most of these rockets out of the air. And with that, I stop sharing my screen. I breathe. I turn it over to you, Rabbi. I see we've got some people in the chat room, and I will take some questions, please.
Okay, so let me see what's in the chat.
I see there's an old friend from another synagogue in New York, which is very nice. Eric. Hi, Eric, from Central Synagogue.
Do you see? I don't see any questions. I have a question. Do you see
Please,
questions?
there's what's that? Yes. Oh, there's one from Eric, but it's okay. Hi, Eric. I answered Eric. Okay. Yes.
I have a question about how has Israeli society changed? And you didn't talk anything about the different ethnic groups and the immigration much after the Russians. How has that impacted Israeli society, and for the negative, for the positive? What about non-Jews coming to Israel? How has that impacted society?
Multiple questions, Rabbi. The last week I talked. I think last week, unfortunately, you weren't necessarily you weren't up to scratch last week, Rabbi.
Sorry, no.
No, it's okay. But last week I talked about the major immigration Operation Solomon and Operation Moses in '84 and Solomon of Ethiopian Jewry. I talked about the massive influx to the former Soviet Union. Numbers wise, 1 of every 5 Israelis sit around the table and speak in Russian or Ukrainian in the former Soviet Union. About 150,000 immigrants from Ethiopia. SIGD, the Ethiopian major holiday, where they would go for a trek up to the highest mountain near where they lived and pray for returning to Jerusalem, has now become a national holiday in Israel. There are huge issues in integrating immigrants, but I think the difference between the immigration in the 80s and 90s of Jews from the former Soviet Union and Ethiopia, again, falls in the context of that major raison d'etre of the kibbutz galuyot, the ingathering of the Israels, of Jews from all corners of the earth. And there's still huge challenges on the one hand. On the other hand, I think most Israelis recognize that Israel is a much richer, I mean, you could say economically, because there were a huge number of scientists who came in the 90s from the former Soviet Union who were really involved in, in the startup nation field, which is fantastic. Come to my gym in a typical middle class city in the center of the country. There are no Ethiopians. I've never seen an Ethiopian Israeli. That's not true. Once I've seen an Ethiopian Israeli in the gym, but the language in my shower, in the men's shower, for you ladies who never go in there, number 1 is Hebrew, number 2 is Russian, number 3 maybe is English. So the huge impact in many areas in Israel. We went to a wedding last night. My son's best friend, a traditional Israeli, his family. That, not religious at all. Grandparents might have been traditional, but there was an Orthodox rabbi. Unfortunately, they didn't do what our son did and used our Reform rabbi. But he was kind of open-minded. He let the groom, after the ceremony, he let the bride give the groom a ring, and they both read a very nice bracha to each other, which was nice. But she, Sharon, the bride, is from a Russian-speaking family. And it was so amazing. And there were a couple words in Russian. It was so amazing that I never knew she was Russian. She'd been at our house a number of times. And the fact that, this traditional, Asaf's parents are Sephardim, and she's Russian, they're marrying together. So I think and if I ask my kids in their 20s, where their parents are from, they might not even know that their parents are from the former Soviet Union. So in the early years, I think there were lots of challenges. There was resentment by other veteran Israelis, those who came Holocaust survivors or from Middle Eastern countries. Why are you in the 90s, Russians and Ethiopians, getting all this support from Israel? You know what we had to do when we came? You too should go, So there's still that. There's a lot of influence in culture, a lot of pop music in particular, hip hop from Ethiopian community. It's still an ingathering of the exiles. But I would say, Rabbi, that if I look at Israel today, and I compare it to, our second week, so 3 weeks ago, where I talked about the new Jew, or even in the first week, right? The idea of the founding fathers and mothers to create a brand new person, somebody who speaks Hebrew, who's able to defend the country, who's able to engage in physical labor, and to kind of homogenize everybody into the same thing, the Ari ben Canaan, as it were, like everybody's got to Hebraicize their name and everyone's going to be the same. It's changed. And I think the real impetus that changed was the critical number of immigrants in the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. When so many come, over 1 million in a decade, And I showed some slides last week of signs in Russian and government offices. It never used to be that way. You don't know Hebrew, learn Hebrew. Why put Russian or French or English? And because the number was so large, you see that Israel kind of said, not everybody has to homogenize. Let us celebrate difference. Let us now have Ethiopian restaurants and Georgian restaurants and not Lithuanian, because there's nothing to eat in Lithuania, but other ethnic forms. And it's legitimate to speak Russian to your son in the changing room of the gym and not having to speak Hebrew. So I think Israel has come a long way. And moving along this access from the we to the me or the I, and some negative aspects, but is much more embracing of the dignity, as the late great Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs used to say, the dignity of difference. That it's okay to to call your son Misha. He doesn't have to be Michael, So challenges, but I think probably more blessings than not in Israel.
And what about like the attitude toward Jews who don't immigrate to Israel, to American Jews, to European Jews? Because it used to be very, they used to look down on them and say, why aren't you living here? And if you're really dedicated, you would move. And there's a tension, especially religiously, and I don't mean Orthodox wise, as a Reformed Jew in Israel, between American Jews and Israeli Jews. So what's going on there?
Look, there used to be a term, it was actually called Shlilat Gola, denigration or denial of the diaspora or dispersion. And it's changed a lot. I mean, if you look at the conversation that our politicians have with American Jewish leadership, it's changed in some aspects. In other aspects, it's like, we don't really care about the Western Wall. Thank you very much. If you want an egalitarian place, right? That's not our issue. That's your Mishigas and your American Jewry. The conversation has changed. Birthright, I think, was a very major impact on that. Why? Because the original money for Birthright in 1999, a third of it was from Israeli taxes. And you heard some voices in Israel saying, what? Why do we have to spend our taxes to bring, affluent, not every Jew, obviously, I know, outside, but who can afford it? Many of whom can afford to come to Israel. Why do we have to pay for them to come to Israel? And I think the idea is that because there's this shared Jewish peoplehood notion. There's a museum in Tel Aviv called Beit HaTfutzot, the Diaspora Museum, founded in the late 70s. And the idea was that what is it that Jews brought from outside of Israel into Israel? Now the museum has been rebranded. Now it's called the Museum of the Jewish People. And I think that's very symbolic of the nature of the change in Israel. One of the big challenges, and there are a couple of books that are written about this by Danny Gordis and by, his name is escaping me now, Israeliness by, he writes for Arutz. It'll come back to me in a few minutes. But both of them are kind of recognizing the divergence of particularly American Jewry and Israeli Jewry. And then American Jewry is becoming more liberal, more universal. Israeli Jewry is becoming more secular. Israeli Jewry is becoming more religious, more particular, more nationalistic, more conservative. And that, I think, is kind of moving both communities in different directions. Our children and grandchildren will hopefully continue this conversation. Although I see some comments up here in the chat. Do you see them, Rabbi? What others think this series will do for their interactions with people who are anti-Zionist? Interesting. I hope it will give you more tools. My short answer to the question that I think it's Edward who asks about how will it would help people in terms of dealing with people who are anti-Zionist. Look, Israel's complicated. America's complicated. We're doing 6 sessions. I could do 8 sessions. I could do 10 sessions. And we're still not going that deep. I mean, I've done a lot of work on this and you've done a lot of listening, but still, there's a lot here. And I think that just like in America, that one of the biggest problems / challenges that your society is dealing with is this notion of that the world is either, right or wrong, black or white. And it's much more complicated than that. And anybody who says, Israel reserves no right to exist because it's an imperialist, they need to study their history and they might not be interested in it because for them, their worldview, it's like in Christian theology, there's something called liberation theology. In the 60s and 70s, particularly in Central and South America. It essentially said from a Christian theological point of view, the underdog is who a good Christian should support. It's not about what the actual issue is, it's about who's the underdog. So if the Palestinians are the underdogs, they're fewer, they're weaker, they're poor, then you got to support them and not the Israelis. So my answer to anybody who is anti-whatever is to as we said, the Seder, Tseulmad, go out and study, go out and learn the issues. There's a lot there, but, it's complicated. Most Israelis think that there should be a two-state solution. How do we get there? I'm not so sure. Do most Palestinians think that? Oh, then you should have a one-state solution. Well, a one-state solution doesn't work for us. So there's a lot to learn. And I think in any conversation on any subject, the more you know about it, the better informed you are to try to have a conversation. 1. 2, not everybody wants to listen, which is another issue. Okay, I have time for one more question, Rabbi, if there's one.
I don't and I have Q&A, but I don't have chat. So if you see one, here, chat, I see now. I come from a reformed San Francisco Valley. I am now Zionist due to learning about the history. Oh, they live in a bubble. That is just a comment. There aren't a lot of, there's no question. What is the Turkish Commission? Do you like our new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett? What do you think about him?
Well, that's politics. Look, I will say this, and with this I will end, because I got to get an airplane in a few hours. And by the way, I'm seeing you in the same time zone. I'm going to visit my folks in Vancouver, so I will be with you same time, same place. But for me, it'll be a different time and a different place next week. But the short answer is this. The government in Israel today is unprecedented. Again, when we talk in America, in particular, about the bifurcation of society, I read these articles every single day, the greater incidence of people getting corona in red states and red constituencies.
Right.
Like everything that you talk about in America is through a prism. Watch CNN and it's anti-Trump. Watch Fox and it's anti-Biden. It's got nothing to do about really what's happening. It's about a prism through which one sees things. And I think in terms of what's happening in Israeli politics, we've never had a coalition of 8 parties, from an Islamist party on the far left, to Meretz, a far left party, to Labour Party, to all these other parties, to parties in the far right, coming together. Because there is a recognition, and I think this is a blessing, there's a recognition amongst these 8 parties that the greatest need is to have a budget and to get rid of a prime minister who most people think shouldn't be there because he's under trial for all sorts of bad things, So I think it's very, very good news that we're there. I hope it will last. We have a budget. I hope that there will be a rotation in November of 2023, but time will tell what will happen. And the truth of the matter is that the biggest issue most Israelis think about is security. That, are we going to be here tomorrow morning?
Right.
Most Israelis have the greatest of confidence in the military to ensure our security, regardless of who is in government. And by the way, when there is an issue in Gaza, there's almost always consultation with the leader of opposition, and they almost always see eye to eye. And with that,
have a great trip. Nisiya Tova.
Next week.
We'll see you next week.
Forward. Okay. All right.
Bye, everyone. Guys. Thank you for joining us for another fantastic session. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.